Okay, we have a presentation today by Professor Vasco Rato. He is visiting Tulare from mainland Portugal, Lisbon, in the European continent. Those of you who are in Portuguese language classes know a little bit about this. Everyone else, Professor Rato is studied in the United States. He has a PhD, a doctorate, from Georgetown University, and he, besides being a teacher, he is also the president of a foundation that has been partners with our school, with Tulare Union, with our Sopers Club, with our Portuguese language classes, to promote culture here in the San Joaquin Valley. How many of you planning on going to Fresno State? Let me see hands. Anybody think about going to Fresno State after school, after high school? How many? Okay. Yesterday, Dr. Rato signed an agreement with Fresno State, and where starting already this year, there will be an exchange program between Fresno State and the University of the Azores in Portugal, where at first we'll have probably about 15 students starting next year from Fresno State that will go to the Azores, a summer program of about 3 weeks, and then vice versa from the Azores here. So hopefully if you go to Fresno State, you're able to benefit from this. Anyway, he'll be talking about the transatlantic relationships, that is, between the United States and Europe, all of Europe, and in particular Portugal, and the whole area of the Iberian Peninsula where Portugal and Spain are located. Okay, so again, I want to thank all the teachers in the World Language Department who agreed to have all of you here. I think there's also Miss Hendricks in classes here, right? Are you guys here? You guys in the house? What? Yeah, here, okay. What about from Mission Oak? Do we have Mission Oak? And we have Tulare Western? There's a lot. And do we have, and where are all the Spanish classes? Okay, good. And I think there's a couple of P classes. Where are the P classes? Mr. Schaefer. And where are the Portuguese language students? Okay, good. Okay, now I need your attention. Be respectful. Okay, be quiet so you don't have to be exited out and embarrassed by it and then not be able to participate in the assemblies or rallies for this year. And please give a big Tulare Redskin and a Tulare Union Redskin and a Tulare, all three schools, welcome to Professor Vasco Rato. Big welcome. A big one.
Eu hoje vou falar em inglês. And I do speak English, so you're okay. First of all, I'd like to thank Mr. Denise Marches for the invitation to be here. As well as principal Michelle Nunley. I was invited to come here a few months ago, and things had just been delayed, so fortunately now is the time. And I guess I should start by telling you what my job is, and it's kind of a strange job, because what I am supposed to do is to promote understanding and the relationship between Portugal and the United States. Now, if you look at the map there, Portugal's that little piece of country at the furthest western part of Europe in green. So compared to the United States, it's not very big. That map is off because the Portugal is actually smaller in comparison to the United States than what you see on the map. But what I have to do is, in a sense, try to develop a better understanding in the United States of what Portugal is and what Portuguese people do and what the country is all about. And the easier part of the job is explaining in Portugal what the United States is, American culture, and so forth. So this is basically what I do. But if you look at the map, you'll also notice that we're actually neighbors, because countries have this thing called sovereignty over the sea. In other words, part of the ocean belongs to individual countries. And Portugal and the United States touch in the sea. So while we don't touch the land, obviously, we do touch in the sea. And so this is what I am supposed to do. Now, the question that I was asked to address today is the relationship between the United States and Europe. I'll try to be relatively brief so I don't bore you too much. But I'd like to start by asking you obviously have heard China, Russia, that big yellow country up there in the right-hand side. But I'm not so sure if you've heard of Djibouti.
Yeah.
Well, you probably haven't. You probably haven't heard of Djibouti. Have you heard of the Gulf of Guinea?
Yes.
Probably haven't. And have you heard of the Spratly Islands?
Yes.
I'm not sure if you have. I could also ask you if you've heard of Crimea or Kosovo, a number of places. So the challenge when talking about Europe, United States, so forth, the challenge is, if you look at the map, you're way on the left-hand side, and we're really far. So why should you care? So why would somebody in the San Joaquin Valley care about the relationship between Europe and the United States? Well, part of the answer lies in these places you've never heard of. Or I should say, you've never heard of them until you hear of them. What I mean by this is that a lot of places in the world are relevant for the United States, except you just don't know it. Now, Djibouti is this little place, I don't have a pointer, but if you can see up there, there's a Africa. It's very hard to point out. Anyways, it's a very small country, but I don't know if you know, you have a lot of military personnel in Djibouti. And from Djibouti, a lot of American servicemen actually sea service throughout all of Africa. And it's a very important country. Never heard of it. It's very important. The Crimea, another one I referred to, is actually a place that the Russians have annexed. It used to belong to the Ukraine, now it belongs to Russia. Now, why would this be important to you? Because it threatened the annexation of Crimea. That's not me. It's kind of like the Academy Awards. I've barely started and you're already playing music.
Este é o momento do Portugal. O mundialmente famoso concurso Twist do Jezebel.
Just use the button. Just press the mute button on the computer.
Where's that coming from? It seems like a fleet.
What? Yep.
Now, what I was saying is that there are a lot of places you've never heard of that are extremely important to the United States and to you personally and the way you live. Just because you haven't heard of them doesn't make them that irrelevant. Now, the question again is, so why should you care? Living here in this valley, why should you care about Europe? Why should you care about Djibouti? Why should you care about a lot of places? Well, the answer is relatively simple, actually. What happens in these places very much affects the way you live. Now, Americans live well in terms of material wealth. They also have a lot of security. You don't worry about a lot of things that other people in other parts of the world worry about. And the fact that you live this way largely depends on what happens in other places. Now, I know that recently in American politics, a lot of people seem to suggest that you can live all by yourselves without really caring or disregarding what everyone else does and thinks and says, but it's not true. You can't live by yourselves. And the relationship that is most important to the United States is still Europe. Now, this is what I want to talk about. Why is Europe important? The first reason has to do, I think, with common values. If any of you go to Europe, you will talk to Europeans, probably in English, because most Europeans now speak English. And what you will notice is that they think very much like you do. They watch, in many cases, the same movies. They watch the same series on television. And they listen to the same kind of music. And more importantly than all of this sharing of popular culture, more important than all of this, is they think like you about the world. In other words, Europeans believe in democracy, they believe in the rule of law, they believe in women's rights, they believe in societies that are relatively fair and where the poor don't starve, so it is incumbent upon the rest of society to give a helping hand when needed. They believe all of the stuff you believe. Europeans haven't always believed these things. In fact, they believe these things today because the United States was so present in Europe over the last 50 years. Now, I don't know if you all know that the first war that the American Republic carried out was actually in a place called the Barbary Coast. You probably have never heard of this either. Or you probably know it today as Libya. Now, even back after the immediate years following the founding of the Republic, what happened in Europe, the Mediterranean, so Libya is that blue country you see in northern Africa, what happened there mattered. And guess what? It still matters. And so, Europeans think very much like you. They don't think like you about everything or in every way, but they sure think more like you than anywhere else in the world. Now, as I said, this is an accident. This has to do with history, and it has to do with what happened in 1945. I'll be very brief. When Europe had a world war, and by world war we mean a generalized war in 1939 to 1945, the Americans participated. So you know about the war effort in the Pacific, but equally important was the war effort, the American war effort in Europe during that period. Now, after 1945, most European countries were poor, broken by the war, and they needed a lot of help. In addition to that, there was one country that most other European countries considered a threat, and that's that big yellow one, now called Russia. It used to be called the Soviet Union. Now, the countries to the left of Russia were quite preoccupied that the Soviet Union would pose a military threat. In other words, that the Soviet Union would invade and dominate all of Europe. And the Americans were also very preoccupied with this. So in the late 1940s, an organization was created called NATO. You've probably heard of it. It's the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And basically what NATO did was created an alliance between Western Europe, the United States, and Canada. And that's why it's called North Atlantic, because this alliance was structured around the Atlantic countries. And the aim was to prevent the Soviet Union from invading the rest of Europe. Now, this meant that Americans had a military presence in Europe. And it's still there. The Soviet Union no longer exists, but the military presence is in that American military presence continues in Europe. Now, for review of Portuguese heritage, you have probably heard of Lages and Ceia. Now, Lages, for you that are not of Portuguese heritage, is basically in the middle of the ocean between Portugal and the United States. And Lages was an American military base that's still there. It's still there. And so Europe is very important for the security of the United States. And if you all are proud of the fact that the United States is a world power, it's very important elsewhere, well, part of the reason is that it has troops in many parts of the world. Doesn't mean, and I don't want to suggest that this is good or bad, it is as it is. This is a reality. And so Europe is very important to the United States for this reason. Part of the reason that the United States is a superpower is because it has European allies. And if Americans turn their back on Europe and they start thinking they don't care what happens in Europe, I can assure you that Europeans will begin to think they don't care what happens to the United States. And so the relationship is very important from a political perspective. And it is possible to have this relation precisely because of these common values I talked about. We all believe basically the same thing. And so this relationship is very important. Now, this relationship between the United States and Europe is quite extraordinary. Think about it. You don't have a similar relationship with Asia. You do not have a similar relationship with Africa or South America. It's the only relationship of this sort that you have. It's with Europe. And there are other reasons for this. Now, you may say, but what is the point of having American troops in Europe? Because the Soviet Union, the reason why they went there in the first place, or they stayed there, I should say, after 1945, it no longer exists, so why bother? Well, the reason is Crimea and Georgia. Not Georgia in the south, but Georgia, the country in Europe. Now, Russia today is, in the minds of a lot of people, again, an aggressive country that does what countries shouldn't do. In other words, Russia has invaded a couple of countries lately. The United States is very preoccupied with this, as obviously is with Europe. Now, again, the question is, why should you care? Well, the reason actually is quite simple, because if the United States doesn't take a position on this, then Europeans will do it by themselves, and this relationship will break down. In other words, and these are all very complex things, but what I'm trying to say to you is what matters in other parts of the world, and what happens in Europe is very important to you. Now, you might think, or you might say, but isn't Europe this peaceful continent? Well, yes and no. Europe is a peaceful continent. We are trying to integrate all of these countries. It's called the European Union. But it hasn't been simple. But part of the reason that Europeans were able to integrate was because the United States was there, present. So part of the reason we have peace in Europe is because the United States was there. Part of the reason. And by extension, I think you could say that if the United States turns its back on Europe, the probability of having peace in the future is less than it is today. This is very important for us, obviously, in Europe, and this is what makes the Russian question so very difficult. Because if European peace is to be maintained, and it's important for everybody that it's maintained, then it's necessary to have Russians behave in a different fashion, not go around invading other countries. This, again, cannot be done without the help of the United States. Now, this is one reason why the relationship is important. It's historical, common values, political interests on both parts. So it's good for you and it's good for us. That's one reason. There's a second reason that's more immediate, and that is terrorism. Now, you became familiar with terrorism on 9/11. Europeans are familiar with terrorism long before that. European cities have been targets for bombs, for assassinations, for a lot of violence during a very long time, way before 9/11. Now, the point here is that if the United States wants to combat terrorism, then it requires the help of Europeans. And if Europeans want to combat terrorism, Europeans require the help of the United States. How is this done? There are a number of ways. First, do you know that 9/11 was actually planned in Europe? Most of the people that carried out the attacks on the Twin Towers lived in Europe and carried it out of Europe at some point in their lives. Now, after 9/11, the European governments and the United States began to cooperate on combating terrorism. They began to exchange information. Every time I get on a plane in Portugal, it goes into a computer and the American authorities know when I arrive in the United States that I'm on that plane. Same thing with all of you. Every time you get on a plane to Europe, European authorities know who you are and they can assess the kind of risk level involved. So one of the reasons why in the last 15 years or so you haven't had a lot of terrorist attacks is because this kind of exchange of information has actually worked. European and American governments have actually stopped a lot of these terrorist acts. But they're also doing it through a different instrument. Before, it was possible in Europe, in countries like Switzerland, to have secret bank accounts. So the American government, for example, if you had an account in Switzerland, the American government would know you had it. Which meant that people that had accounts in Switzerland didn't pay taxes. And so it was a good deal for them. But it also meant that a lot of these places where these kind of financial transactions were possible also took money from terrorist organizations. And so over the last 15 years or so, what the American and the Europeans have tried to do is make sure they control financial flows, who deposits money, where, and how it's used. This is for an obvious reason, because if you plan out a terrorist attack, if you plan it, you have to have money to finance it. And so if you cut the money off, then a lot of these attacks can be carried out. Now, this is very important because it has created a safer world for all of us. And as I said earlier, if you live safely, part of it is because Europeans are cooperating with the Americans. It's not just Europeans, it's governments in other parts of the world. But your safety, your European safety is partially dependent on Europeans, as our safety in Europe is dependent on the United States. So in addition to the common values, the political relationship and so forth, there's a very, let's admit it, a very selfish reason for us all to cooperate. And that is, it makes us simply safer. And it's not safer just in relation to terrorism. It's in relation to other things. I talked about getting on a plane and going to Europe and so on and so forth. That sounds relatively easy. You probably don't think about it. You get on an airplane and a few hours later, you're in another part of the world. Well, it's actually a lot more complicated than that because the planes have to have authorizations. And so the fact that you're flying from one place to another presupposes, it means that a lot of cooperation already exists between civil authorities, between the governments. And so a lot of things you take for granted, in effect, you can do them because there's a lot of cooperation in governments that you often don't think about. And so it's this type of cooperation is extremely important. Now, I also said that part of the reason that the United States is so wealthy is because of other countries. It's a thing called trade. You live well because you're very successful in a number of things, in producing and selling goods and services to other parts of the world. Now, guess what? Everybody has probably heard about the future the future is Asia, the United States has to look towards Asia and so forth. Well, I think it does have to look towards Asia for a number of reasons. But looking towards Asia, which is very easy here in this part of the country, but looking towards Asia in terms of commerce, in terms of trade, doesn't mean you should turn your back to Europe, or indeed that you can turn your back to Europe. You can't. And the reason is very simple. If you take all of the wealth produced in the world, now economists have a name for this, it's called GDP, gross domestic product. If you take all of the wealth created in the world, 60%, more than half, is created in the United States and Europe. So, I know China is a big country, I know it is a developing country, I know it is richer today than it was 10, 20, 30 years ago, but the fact remains that 60% of all the world's wealth is created in the United States and Europe. So, even if Americans want to ignore Europe, they can't. Unless they want to live a lot worse than they do now. And I don't think you want that. Now, the other aspect of this is very interesting. Not only are Americans the biggest investors in Europe, but Europeans are actually the biggest investors in the United States. This simply means that the money that is necessary to create factories, to create jobs, to create farms, a lot of that money, a lot of that investment comes from Europe. And a lot of the investment that is necessary in Europe also to create economic activity and to create jobs, a lot of that money comes from the United States. In other words, without this sort of relationship between the United States and Europe, we would lose tremendously in economic terms. We would all become very poor, very much poorer. Now, the US investment in Europe is 3 times greater than in Asia. This means that while Asia is very important, actual investment is 3 times greater in Europe than it is American investment, than it is in Asia. So despite some of the things that you hear on TV sometimes, the reality of things is not exactly that. And so the European relationship continues to be very important. And what we're trying to do now, Europe and the United States, is actually take down some of the trade barriers, some of those technical impediments to trade. What this means is making trade easier. We call it a free trade agreement between the United States and Europe. Now, if we did this, and it's not all that hard to do, from a technical perspective, it's a little harder to do politically, it would overnight basically mean that a family of 4 in the United States would have an increase of about $800. And so we all have a common interest in maintaining the political relationship because it does allow us to have a more peaceful world. We do have an interest in maintaining the cooperation between governments because it does allow us to fly in airplanes and do a lot of things and have internet and so on and so forth. All of these things only exist because governments permit them to exist. And the final reason is that the relationship between Europe and the United States, of course, is very important for the way we live and for the type of wealth that we do. We would all be much poorer without each other. And so, irrespective of where you come from and what your heritage is, but as Americans, I think you should all understand that a world in which the United States turns its back on Europe is actually a more frightening world, a more violent world, and certainly not a world where we can live the way we do. And that's basically what I have to tell you. Thank you.
How about another round for Dr. Vasco Rato, please? A big thank you. Hopefully you've learned something not only about Portugal, but also about the entire world and how important it is, how we in America still have a very, very powerful voice in the world. And that's why, based on what Dr. Vasco Rato said, that's why each and every one of you must do well in school, get a good college degree, and make the world a better place. So a big hand for all of you also. Big hand for all Tulare Union, Mission Oak and Tulare Western, everybody. And I want to see Twitter light up. So hashtag FLAD Tulare with your comment about it. If you're in the Portuguese language classes, you'll get some extra credit points, lots. If you're in one of the Spanish classes, I'm sure Senora de Reda, Senora Renteria, Senora Bruns loves to tweet, and Senora Campos, they will all give you the pontos. So just add hashtag FLAD Tulare, okay? And put a comment, put a picture, put something related to what you heard here today, so you can get those extra credit points. Again, big hand to your teachers. And a big, big round of applause. She's way in the back, we're working, to the most awesome principal in the whole entire galaxy, Dr. Nunley. And again, a big thank you to Dr. Vasco Rato one more time. Come on, give him a big, big well, thanks. Okay, so remember, to go ahead and do that, hashtag FLAD Tulare, and also we would like all of the students, okay, all of you who did not come with a teacher, came from other classes, okay, you guys can go ahead and leave now through these side doors, okay? So all, not the teachers, not the students who came with teachers, so all